The galactic war had raged on for years. At first, Xylox had been protected under the banner of the Interstellar Coalition, a federation of powerful races that had vowed to defend the vulnerable. Yet as the enemy, the brutal, expansionist Kreth Empire, marched across the stars, the Coalition's promises began to falter. One by one, the stronger races withdrew their forces, preferring to defend their own territories rather than waste resources on a defenseless world. Xylox's allies, once so vocal in their pledges of protection, had quietly abandoned them to face the Kreth alone. In the heart of Xylox's capital, Eldra, the Xyloxian Council gathered in desperation. The elders, with their soft, iridescent skin and delicate limbs, huddled in the dimly lit chamber, their once calm faces now etched with fear. "They've all left us," Elder Shara, the wisest among them, whispered, her voice trembling. "The Coalition will not answer our calls. We are alone." The youngest elder, Lien, stood by the window, watching as the Kreth ships slowly gathered in orbit. "Surely someone will come. Someone must," he said, though the crack in his voice betrayed his doubt. But the council was silent, each elder knowing the truth. No one was coming. The Coalition, in its arrogance, had deemed the Xyloxians expendable. To them, Xylox was a strategic loss, not a humanitarian one. And the Kreth Empire, seeing the planet undefended, had wasted no time preparing for its final assault. The people of Xylox, once full of hope and trust, were now in a state of despair. Their advanced technology, though suited for nurturing life, was no match for the Kreth's war machines. The Xyloxians, never having known conflict, were ill-prepared for the horrors that awaited them. Entire cities had already fallen, their lush forests scorched, their rivers choked with ash. The Xyloxian people, weak and frightened, could only watch as the end crept closer. "We must surrender," one of the elders finally spoke, breaking the long silence. "Perhaps the Kreth will show mercy." Shara shook her head. "The Kreth know no mercy. To them, we are nothing but resources to be mined, flesh to be enslaved. Surrender means annihilation." Lien clenched his fists, frustration bubbling within him. "Then what hope do we have? We've sent distress signals across the galaxy, and no one has answered. No one even cares that we exist." It was true. The Xyloxians were insignificant in the grand scheme of galactic politics. Their planet, once a cherished refuge, was now just another casualty in the Kreth's relentless campaign for dominance. And as their enemies prepared to descend upon them, their hope for salvation flickered like a dying ember. But in the cold expanse of space, a single fleet moved toward Xylox, small in size but resolute in its mission. The humans, relatively new to the galactic stage, had received the Xyloxians' call for help. Unlike the others, they could not turn away. The human race had been forged through adversity, their survival often hinging on compassion as much as strength. Where the more advanced species saw a calculated loss, the humans saw something far more important: the moral obligation to protect the innocent. Aboard the flagship Valiant, Captain Abigail Paulson watched the planet loom larger on the view screen, her face set in grim determination. The human fleet, though smaller and less technologically advanced than the Coalition, was prepared to fight for Xylox's survival. "They're just a small race," Commander Davis said, his brow furrowed. "The others didn't think they were worth it." Abigail's eyes hardened. "That doesn't mean they deserve to die." As the fleet approached Xylox's orbit, Abigail sent a message to the Xyloxian Council. Her voice echoed in the nearly empty chamber in Eldra. "This is Captain Abigail Paulson of the Terran Defense Fleet. We have received your distress call and are here to help." The council members stared in shock, unable to process what they had heard. For the first time in weeks, hope bloomed in Shara's heart. She looked at Lien, whose eyes widened in disbelief. "Humans," he whispered, almost in awe. They came," Shara repeated, her voice steadier now. "Perhaps we are not as alone as we thought." Outside, the Kreth ships gathered, their weapons primed for an easy conquest. But unknown to them, Something far more dangerous had just arrived, a race not bound by politics or power, but by a deep, stubborn sense of right and wrong. Captain Abigail Paulson stood at the helm of the Valiant, her eyes scanning the tactical display as her fleet entered the atmosphere of Xylox. The sprawling alien landscape below was a mix of serene beauty and smoldering devastation, the scars of Kreth aggression evident in the cities reduced to rubble. Though the human fleet was small, just a few frigates and corvettes, it was a symbol of defiance in a galaxy that had turned its back on the defenseless. "Captain, we've established contact with the Xyloxian leadership," said Lieutenant Marcus, her communications officer. His fingers hovered over the console, tension creeping into his voice. "They're overwhelmed. They weren't expecting us." Abigail nodded. "Neither was anyone else," she replied. "And that's exactly why we're here." On the ground, the Xyloxians had gathered in what remained of their capital, Eldra, watching the human ships descend like silent sentinels from the sky. Their iridescent eyes were wide with both awe and skepticism. To them, humans were an enigma, a race barely older than their own history books, who had somehow found it within themselves to risk everything for a people they had never met. The council chamber was quiet as Abigail's face appeared on the holographic display. She looked steady, composed, though the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her shoulders. "I'm Captain Paulson of the Terran Defense Fleet," she said, her voice firm but calm. "We received your distress signal. We know your allies have abandoned you, but we haven't." The council elders exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of relief and disbelief. Elder Shara, still the leader in this dire time, stepped forward. "You've come to defend us? Even against the Kreth?" Her voice wavered, as if asking whether such a promise was even possible. Abigail's eyes hardened with determination. "Yes, we'll defend you with everything we have." The Xyloxians, who had only ever known diplomacy and peace, struggled to comprehend the humans' resolve. The Kreth were not a foe to be trifled with. Their ships were massive, their weapons brutally efficient. Yet these humans, with their comparatively primitive fleet, had come anyway. "What can you possibly do?" asked Lien, the youngest elder, his voice laced with doubt. "The Kreth forces are overwhelming. Our defenses are non-existent." Abigail smiled, though there was no humor in it. "We may not have the most advanced tech in the galaxy, but humans don't give up easily. And we don't need brute force to win this. We fight smart." As the human fleet touched down, Captain Paulson convened with her ground forces and tactical team. They were a small unit, but every member was handpicked for their skill in guerrilla warfare, adaptability, and, most importantly, courage. They all knew they were vastly outnumbered, but none of them flinched at the odds. "Here's the plan," Abigail began, spreading out a holographic map of Xylox and the surrounding space. "We're going to use the terrain and their overconfidence against them. The Kreth expect an easy fight, which is why they're gathering their forces all at once. We'll hit them where they least expect it. Precision strikes on key vessels, supply lines, and command centers." She pointed to a series of mountain ranges that shielded the Xyloxian capital. "These natural formations will give us cover. Our ships don't have their firepower, but we have speed and stealth. If we can disrupt their operations long enough, we'll force them into a retreat." Commander Davis frowned. "And if they press the attack?" Abigail met his gaze, her voice steady. "Then we make them regret it." Hours later, the first wave of Kreth ships descended into the atmosphere, their black hulls blotting out the sky. Their weapon systems hummed ominously, anticipating little resistance from the planet below. What they hadn't counted on was the human fleet, lying in wait just beyond the mountain ranges, hidden from their scanners. On Abigail's signal, a squadron of human corvettes shot forward, weaving through the mountainous terrain with calculated precision. The Kreth barely had time to react before their lead ship erupted into flames, its communications towers severed by a well-placed missile. The Kreth scrambled to reorganize, but the humans moved like ghosts, striking and disappearing before the enemy could return fire. Small, agile ships slipped past the Kreth's defenses, targeting weak points with ruthless efficiency. On the ground, human commandos infiltrated Kreth landing zones, planting explosives and cutting off supply routes. As the battle intensified, the Kreth began to realize they were not facing the easy conquest they had expected. Every time they advanced, they were met with ambushes, hit-and-run tactics, and sabotage. It was chaos, disorder they were unaccustomed to. In the midst of it all, Captain Paulson kept a watchful eye on the battlefield, her mind calculating every risk, every move. "They're getting frustrated," she observed, a thin smile on her lips. "That's when they'll make mistakes." By the end of the first day, the Kreth fleet had stalled, unable to press their attack as effectively as planned. The humans had not only survived, they had disrupted the Kreth's entire operation. For the first time, the Xyloxians, watching from their bunkers, began to believe that perhaps their fate was not yet sealed. Abigail stood on the bridge of the Valiant, her heart racing from the intensity of the day. But as the stars twinkled once more over Xylox, she knew this was only the beginning. The real test was yet to come. The second day of the battle dawned under a bruised sky. Smoke from burning Kreth ships and shattered Xyloxian cities choked the horizon, but the human fleet remained, battered yet unbroken. Captain Abigail Paulson stood on the bridge of the Valiant, her eyes focused on the tactical map that flickered before her. The Kreth forces, stunned by the unexpected resistance, had pulled back to regroup. Yet Abigail knew that this reprieve was temporary. The Kreth were methodical, relentless, and they would not stop until Xylox was ground into dust. The humans had slowed them, but they hadn't stopped them. Not yet. "They're repositioning," Commander Davis reported, his voice grim. "We've got a couple of hours at best before they hit us again, this time in full force." Abigail nodded. "We need to hold them off for as long as possible. Get our fighters prepped and rearm the bombers. If they come, we'll make them pay for every inch." Outside, the human forces moved with quiet efficiency. Soldiers who had barely slept since the battle began now fortified defensive positions, laying traps and preparing for what they knew could be their final stand. Among them, whispers spread of the fallen, brave men and women who had given their lives in the earlier skirmishes to protect the Xyloxians. The losses weighed heavily on everyone, but none more so than Abigail. She allowed herself a moment to stand alone in the quiet of her quarters. The faces of her fallen comrades flickered in her mind, their sacrifices too numerous to count. She had lost friends, soldiers, and heroes, but there was no room for grief now. If they were to win this, more sacrifices would be required. As the Kreth fleet advanced, the skies darkened with their warships. Their sheer numbers dwarfed the human fleet, but still, the humans held their ground. The Valiant's cannons roared to life, sending bursts of plasma toward the enemy, while squadrons of human fighters darted through the chaos, executing precision strikes on Kreth vessels. It was a brutal, grinding fight. The Kreth ships poured firepower into the human defenses, each blast shaking the ground and sending shockwaves through the Xyloxian capital. Despite their best efforts, the human lines were thinning. Ship after ship was lost, and the Kreth inched closer, relentless as ever. In the midst of the battle, Abigail received a message from her ground forces. Lieutenant Graves, leading a small squad of commandos, had intercepted Kreth communications. His voice crackled over the comms. "Captain, we've identified their command ship. It's orbiting just outside the planet's atmosphere. If we can disable it, we'll throw their entire fleet into disarray." Abigail's mind raced. The Kreth command ship was heavily defended, a fortress of steel and plasma cannons. A direct assault would be suicide, but if they could disable it, the Kreth fleet would lose coordination, buying Xylox and the human forces precious time. "We don't have the numbers for a full assault," she replied, "but we can make a surgical strike, take out their command systems, and we might just turn this around." Graves hesitated. "It's a one-way trip, Captain. You know that." Abigail's chest tightened. She knew the risks. Everyone did, but there was no other way. "I know," she said softly. "Prepare your team." As the human fighters broke through the Kreth lines, Lieutenant Graves and his squad moved in toward the Kreth command ship, their small, agile craft barely registering on the Kreth's sensors. Once aboard, they fought through the steel corridors of the massive ship, pushing toward its central command systems. The fighting was fierce, but Graves and his team pressed on, knowing that every second they delayed the Kreth, they gave their people a chance at survival. Meanwhile, on the surface, the Xyloxians watched in awe as the humans continued to defend their home. They had never known such sacrifice, such selflessness. It was alien to them, a concept far beyond their understanding. And yet, the humans fought on, giving everything to protect a race that the galaxy had deemed unworthy of saving. Back on the Valiant, Abigail's gaze remained fixed on the tactical display, her hands clenched into fists. "Come on, Graves," she whispered. A sudden explosion rippled through the Kreth fleet as Graves' team detonated the command ship's power core. The blast sent shockwaves through space, and immediately, the Kreth formation began to falter. Without their command center, their fleet lost cohesion, opening gaps in their defenses. "Now!" Abigail barked. "Hit them with everything we've got." The human fleet surged forward, seizing the advantage. Kreth ships began to retreat, their once unshakable confidence shattered. One by one, they blinked out of orbit, vanishing into hyperspace, leaving Xylox battered but standing. The battle was over. The humans had won, but the victory came at a heavy cost. Graves and his team had sacrificed their lives to secure that final, critical blow, and the human fleet was decimated. But the Kreth were gone, and Xylox was free. As the Xyloxians gathered to thank their human saviors, Captain Abigail stood in silence, gazing up at the stars where so many of her comrades now lay. The Xyloxians' gratitude was overwhelming, but Abigail could only think of the names that would never be spoken again. Still, she knew that their fight had been worth it. The humans had shown the galaxy that they were more than just another race vying for power. They had fought for what was right when no one else would. And now, the galaxy would never forget the courage, the sacrifice, and the stubborn humanity that had turned the tide.